Well, there are mainly really three big headlines, Naga. The first is that they confirm that the Conservatives are still in deep, deep electoral trouble. The 21-point drop in their support in Kingswood is in line with the 19-20-point drop that they're currently suffering in the opinion polls. The 37 to 38-point drop in Wellingborough is actually the biggest loss the Conservatives have ever managed to suffer in a post-war by-election. Now, it may well be that the circumstances surrounding Peter Bone's downfall and his replacement by his partner perhaps added to the party's woes in Wellingborough, but there is no gainsaying the fact that this morning we are still looking at a government that at the moment is staring defeat in the face at the next general election. Headline number two, however, is that the Conservatives' troubles are no longer simply confined to losing votes to Labour. Reform UK, who hitherto haven't been doing particularly well in by-elections, but whose support had increased recently in the polls, now have begun in these by-elections to put votes in the ballot box. 13% in Kingswood, 13% in Wellingborough, 10% in Kingswood. And the problem that means for the Conservatives that we know from the opinion polls is that for every one voter who's switching from Conservative to Labour, there's now another one who's switching to Reform. And while not everybody who voted for Reform would have voted Conservative if they couldn't vote for Reform, they'll come disproportionately from the Conservatives. And it just means that that coalition of Leave voters, pro-Brexit voters that took Boris Johnson to victory in 2019 is just fragmenting further as Reform now threaten to take more votes away from the Conservatives. That leaves Labour, headline number three, as the beneficiaries. Two more by-election gains, 2 seats where the swing required for them to win was above what they need to win a general election overall majority. And while you can quibble at the edges about the fact that Labour's support is basically only up about half as much as the Conservative support is down, the truth is, I think today, Sir Keir Starmer looks as likely to be the next Prime Minister as he did 24 hours ago, if indeed not even more so.
Okay, that's a really good overview, John. Thanks very much for that. So, just to extrapolate, often when we talk about by-elections, you know, we're going to be talking to all the parties today, but when they talk about by-elections, often the government in power says, well, they're always an indicator, there was a reaction to the government in power, they're not really a key indicator or a crucial or a decisive indicator about a general election. But what you're saying is that these are indicating an outcome at the general election.
Well, they are indicative of the current position we are at. There are still 9 months or so to go until the general election, and things could change. And certainly what is true, if you're going to make sense of these things, you shouldn't be saying, oh, well, if there were a general election tomorrow, the Labour Party would have got a 28% swing in Wellingborough. But what you should be doing is comparing by-elections with by-elections. The last time we saw a government losing by-elections with the regularity which the Conservatives have been doing so in this Parliament. They've lost 9 in this Parliament, although they did gain 1 in Hartlepool. The last time a government did so with these kinds of swings, it was the 92 to 97 Parliament that ended in serious defeat for John Major's Conservative Party. In other words, we seem to be, as the opinion polls are also saying, in a very similar place as we were in the run-up to 1997. Now, maybe history won't repeat itself, but the truth is the Conservatives are going to have to defeat the historical record to come back from where they are. Second caveat that politicians will say, and they're quite right, the turnout is low. And indeed, it's been a feature of by-elections in this Parliament that turnout has been falling quite markedly. You have to go back to the 1997 to 2001 Parliament to find a similar regularity of falls in turnout. But I think that the conclusion to draw from that is not that somehow or another that the Conservative Party will be able to win lots of voters back very easily, as opposed to the fact that all of our parties are facing an electorate which is deeply discontented, deeply pessimistic, and at the moment are not entirely sure that it's worth their shoe leather to go to the polls at all. And we at the moment, I think, are heading potentially for another record low turnout in the forthcoming general election.
You know, John, it's really interesting when you examine the pressure that the leaders of both parties, the Conservatives and the Labour Party, are under. Our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, has said that Keir Starmer has had one of the worst weeks in his leadership as Labour leader.
Yep.
Have you seen any bearing of that on, or any influence of that on these by-elections?
Well, I think it's very difficult to argue in these by-elections that when the Labour Party ends up with the second biggest swing from the Conservatives in post-war electoral history, that we can argue that these by-elections indicate that the Labour Party has suffered because of the arguments about its candidate in Rochdale, which polls in 2 weeks' time, or indeed the reversal of the decision on the 28 billion investment fund. And we've had one poll out yesterday evening suggested Labour support might be down a couple of points since before the Rochdale row, but frankly that is too small a read upon which to ground anything at all. I think we have to get much more evidence from the opinion polls before we get any sense at all as to whether or not this has damaged Labour. Indeed, actually, one of the headlines from the poll that came out yesterday is that 49% of people just don't have a view as to whether Sir Keir Starmer did or did not handle the Rochdale situation well. You and I have to remember that some of the things that excite those of us who follow the developments of SW1, this doesn't always percolate through.